What a wonderful evening we have ahead of us. I'm so excited to welcome a sizable on-site audience with many new faces. That's what we really want to see here, is not only the faces whom we know and love, but new faces. So thank you for coming, some of you from far away. And then we have hundreds of people accompanying us online. So welcome to you all as well. In the crowd, we have many beloved students of St. Vladimir's, faculty, spouses, staff, and several guests who are related to, well, spiritually related to what we're doing tonight, including Father Siluan Justiniano, another collaborator with several of you, guests on the Orthodox Arts Journal. If you'll allow me to just speak for a few minutes to introduce a little bit our Institute of Sacred Arts here, and then I will introduce my colleague, Dr. Rosita Schroeder, sitting across from me, and she will talk about or invite our panelists each to say a few things, and then we open it out to discussion amongst ourselves and then with you. So we have, by God's grace, at Institute of Sacred Arts here at St. Vladimir Seminary. What is it? Well, we have a curriculum in the arts, which I can invite you, if you are a musician, artist, composer, scholar of the arts, someone interested in the arts, and you're interested in studying the arts in the context of Orthodox Christian theology and liturgy, which is really their true home, consider coming here to St. Vladimir's to study. Among our other activities, we host artists in residence. We're trying to do this every year. This year we have with us Dr. Alexander Lingus, the musicologist. Last year we had the iconographer George Cordis. We produce concerts as we can. We produced a wonderful concert last month with Capella Romana. We've got several interesting books in progress. I think the next 2-3 years, you'll see several publications coming from the Institute of Sacred Arts at St. Vladimir Seminary Press. And I do want to let you know of a book that we are just getting underway together with several of our panelists tonight. And this is a book on Orthodox liturgical arts in North America. So that's something that if you have an interest in supporting or contributing to in any way, please get in touch with us. Generally, if you would like to follow our work, our website is instituteofsacredarts.com. You'll find lots of information there. You'll find also the podcast there that I host called Luminous Conversations on Sacred Arts. Last but not least, we hold events like this one. And I think we're all pretty excited about the people we've been fortunate enough to gather with us tonight, some of the finest liturgical artists of our time, who are also among our most astute and informed commentators on liturgical art in the Orthodox Church. I will introduce them only briefly in order to maximize our time in conversation. I said I would also introduce you to my colleague, Dr. Rosita Schroeder, who teaches art history here at the seminary. Professor Schroeder, who is also assistant director of our Institute of Sacred Arts. We are co-moderating this discussion, and periodically we'll come in with our own ideas, but certainly this is an evening for our panelists to have the primary voice. Our guests this evening scarcely need introduction, but here we go anyway. Aidan Hart is a sculptor, carver, iconographer, and iconologist, created works in over 25 countries of the world, commissioned by Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Anglican cathedrals, monasteries, and individual persons. He's also an author, most recently of festal icons, but also of beauty, spirit, matter icons in the modern world, and the now classic techniques of icon and wall painting. Andrew Gould is an artisan and designer specializing in traditional buildings and liturgical art. He's designed dozens of new buildings, renovations, and custom liturgical furnishings, also of profound beauty. Jonathan Pageau, as an artist, is primarily a carver. His work has been commissioned by churches, bishops, priests, lay people in the United States, Canada, Europe, and Asia. As a writer, together with Andrew Gould and other colleagues, he founded and contributes regularly to the Orthodox Arts Journal. And as a speaker, Jonathan has a massive internet presence, especially through his YouTube channel, The Symbolic World. Much more could be said about each of our panelists. For tonight, I would only add that each of them, through their work and thought, is a particular embodiment of tonight's theme, which has to do with honoring the cultural heritage of the East in contexts here in the West. And as part of speaking to that theme, Rosita and I have asked each of them to show us some examples of their own work and how it illustrates that beautiful God-given challenge. Dr. Schroeder, I hand the lapel mic over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's an art historian amongst, artists, those who cannot teach, right? And as a Byzantine art historian, I cannot help but say that at the core of contemporary Orthodox sacred art is Byzantine art. In general, Byzantine artists offered a capacious paradigm for sacred art, which has been adapted to various aesthetic sensibilities, whether Russian, Coptic, Ethiopian, or even North American. Byzantine art, which moved to the West via gifts, marriages, wars, especially crusades, or trade, provide the emergence of new and powerful iconographic models. The Man of Sorrows, for example, comes to mind. It was created in Byzantium as a combination between visual and liturgical poetry, and yet it was adopted by the Franciscans in the 13th century as a potent iconographic model for them. The fact that we still build and adorn churches to evoke in one way or another the environment of Byzantine churches is hardly coincidental and speaks to the durability and power of our living tradition. That's why tradition matters. In my opinion, this tradition has been more or less successfully translated in the West, and we have the privilege tonight to speak with people who do this translation with their minds and bodies. And without further ado, I want to invite Andrew Gould to tell us how he does that.
Oh, thank you. Hello, everyone. I specialize in the design of Orthodox churches, as well as other types of buildings. And I'm a convert to Orthodoxy. I've been Orthodox along with my wife for about 18 years now. And I find it very important in my work to be faithful to the liturgical needs and the liturgical traditions of Orthodox worship, whilst also saturating my work with the character of Western cultural heritage, and particularly the unique qualities that make architecture and the decorative arts American. I don't think it's helpful for converts to Orthodoxy to disdain their Western cultural heritage, but rather to find what good elements exist within the cultural heritage of the West, or American art in the specific, that can be brought into Orthodox worship and can be used to beautify the expression of Orthodox churches. I'm going to show just a few examples of my own work to illustrate how I have done this. This is my own parish church in Charleston, South Carolina. And Charleston has a very distinctive architectural heritage. It's a city of old buildings built out of masonry and stucco and painted bright colors. We looked at old churches in downtown Charleston and kind of imagined, using the palette of materials and details that these old churches have, how might we imagine it would look had there been Russian immigrants to Charleston in the 19th century who had built an Orthodox church there, and tried to build what that might have looked like. And Charleston is probably most famous architecturally for its formal gardens that surround all of the historic buildings. When a tourist goes to visit Charleston, the experience is primarily an experience of walking down sidewalks and looking through garden gates into beautiful formal gardens in front of houses and churches. So we knew it was really important to employ a garden designer and gather beautiful antique bricks, beautiful local plants, and build a Charleston style garden to make the church seem rooted to the landscape and in that native culture. This is the front porch of our church. You can see we've paved it with old Charleston bricks and used heavy wooden beams and given it that material feeling of being an old Charleston church. And we were able to gather up antique heart pine reclaimed from old local buildings, and built massive wooden doors for the church. And we carved these door handles that were copied off of an old log cabin in the South. And the iconostasis you see here, even though the iconostasis is a uniquely Eastern typology of church furniture, we worked hard to build the iconostasis in a way that seemed Southern and American, using Southern pine, detailing it very simply. So the beauty of the wood is what's complementing the icons, as opposed to carving it, covering it with ornament, as would be a more typically Eastern European way of handling church furniture. And here you can see some of the furniture that I made. For the nave of the church, a candle stand and an icon stand. And both of these have architectural shapes that derive from 17th century Russian furniture, but the actual way in which they're made is quite American. They're made out of fine hardwoods, and the craftsmanship is extremely refined. They're given a beautiful varnished finish, all of which is quite unlike Russian furniture, which would typically be completely unfinished and rather rough hewn in the case of a village church, or completely gilded and painted and ornamented in the case of an urban church. I also made frames for all of the icons that are inlaid with marquetry banding, a very typically sort of 18th or early 19th century American way of ornamenting woodwork. The sort of things you would see on historic American furniture in a museum. And that kind of detailed materiality, especially, at things like door handles and icon frames, the things that you actually come up very close to and touch. I thought it was very important that materiality make Americans feel at home. And you'll notice, of course, that I'm drawing from American culture sort of the best historic things, the beautiful refined things of 18th and 19th century American culture, which I think is where in American culture we can find things that are worthy of baptizing into the worship in an Orthodox context. I also specialize in making chandeliers for churches, but rather than make them out of ornamental polished brass like the chandeliers in Greece and Russia, I make my chandeliers out of black patinated iron, and they have kind of an American sobriety about them. So here you can see the whole church, and it I hope manages to simultaneously have the exuberant maximalism that we think of when we think of Orthodox liturgical art, but at the same time it has that sort of clarity and simplicity of focus that we see in historic American architecture in particular. I think that to someone who's accustomed to say 18th century colonial American churches, we can see a similar clarity, that there's a clarity of the whole, and there's a clarity of each individual object, and particularly a clear materiality, that the plaster looks like plaster, and the stone looks like stone, and the wood is allowed to look like wood, and the iron is black as iron, that each material retains its unique expression. Everything's not just covered with gilding and painted ornament, as is more typical in a Russian church, for instance, because that honesty of material expression, I think was kind of a hallmark of Anglo-American culture in the 18th and 19th centuries. Another church I designed, also in South Carolina, is St. John of the Ladder in the city of Greenville. This is a wooden church because this is built in upstate South Carolina, not a region that's not as old as Charleston, a region where late 19th century Victorian architecture prevails. And I wanted to design a church that has a Byzantine form, a cruciform and domed form, but is detailed the way one sees in 19th century Protestant churches. So you can see the exterior detailing with the clapboard siding and the rafter tails and so forth, sort of is typical of what you might see in an old Protestant church in the South. And then on the interior, extensive use of tongue and groove wood paneling, very typical of old Southern Protestant churches. A limited amount of plastered surfaces because we wanted to have some iconography, but I didn't want the church to be completely filled with iconography because again, that looks quite exotic to Western eyes. I think a balance of wood paneling and a certain amount of iconography is going to be more in the tradition of what people of a Western culture are accustomed to. And again, you can see the beautiful juxtaposition of those naturally expressed materials with the iron chandeliers and the hand-blown glass lampadas. And we had these columns turned on a lathe out of solid pieces of southern yellow pine. And they're just wonderful to go up and touch. They feel massive. They're very reminiscent of the porch columns on old Southern houses. And I also wanted to point out that the design of this building is not purely Byzantine, that there's also a good deal of what you might call neoclassical detailing in it. You can see on these arcades, even though the column capitals have the impost block that's typical of Byzantine architecture, I decided to ornament the arches themselves using trim and particularly keystones that's really more typical of neoclassical construction, because that's really the typical style of old wooden buildings in America. Buildings from the 18th and 19th centuries would have this kind of Georgian to Greek revival styling with the keystones on the arches. And I think that's something that makes people from an American background come into this church and say, that's something that makes me feel at home. That's something that I've seen in old colonial churches, fine houses. And I'm very pleased that the icon painter working at this church, Seraphim O'Keefe, is painting his icons similarly in a kind of open and spare style that complements the architecture and looks quite distinctly American and modern in a good sense. This really doesn't look anything like painting you'd see at a Byzantine or Russian church from centuries ago. And I'd like to say it rather specifically picks up on that sort of neoclassical clarity. Even I might go so far as to say it reminds me of the kind of heroic Art Deco murals of the 1930s. You can see almost a little bit of Egyptian revival, Greek revival styling in how this is painted, and that's a beautifully modern, in the sort of early 20th century sense of modern American expression in the iconography that I think suits this building just wonderfully. The iconostasis icons in this church are being painted by a really, really brilliant iconographer from Belarus named Anton Dyneko. And this is the central panel of the iconostasis. And you can see he too is painting in what might be called more of a classical style than a Byzantine style. much like certain other sort of genius level iconographers that have come before him, Photius Contaglou, and Archimandrite Xenon from Russia. We tend to see a tendency that iconographers, if they get really, really good, they kind of start going further and further back in time until the work looks more Roman in style than Byzantine. And we see this in Anton Dineco's work, that this looks rather like a Roman fresco more than a Byzantine fresco. And that classical clarity, I think, is a wonderful complement to what I'm trying to do architecturally, kind of go so far back in time in Christian art that it goes, you know, from Byzantium all the way back to the West to Rome, sort of where Christian art began. And this brings me to the second thing I'd like to talk about in this presentation. Peter asked that we talk about how this experience of bridging Eastern and Western traditions gives us certain insights into the state of art in the modern secular world. Sort of what are the problems with contemporary art outside the church, and in what ways can the art that we do sort of heal some of those divisions, or at least illuminate some of those problems. And if I look at the state of art, or perhaps better said, the state of artistic taste in contemporary America, I feel like we observe a certain polarization between art that is too sentimental and art that is too rational, intellectual. And this division tends to parallel sort of religiosity versus secular atheism, that among American religious people, we see a sentimentality to the art that they favor, a preference for art that is highly emotional and not very intellectually serious. I might point both to sort of the praise music of the evangelical church, look at the movies produced by evangelical producers, and we might look at the sort of religious folk art that is favored by Roman Catholics, the sort of pilgrimage site kitsch art, for instance, or the kind of religious art that's favored by sort of old-fashioned Protestants, you know, the very romanticized sort of, you know, Jesus lithographs that you see in, you know, the house of a Baptist from the old days. You know, this somewhat childlike sentimental art, which is, you know, it's a lovely expression, you know, of faith on the one hand, but regrettably, it sort of accentuates the disdain of the other class of people, the sort of secular atheist intellectuals who can very easily dismiss that art as not sophisticated. Whereas if we swing over and look at the art favored by that class of people, the sort of globalist secular elite, we see art that is excessively rational and intellectual, the sort of extreme cases of abstract painting, 12-tone music, art that is almost sort of aggressively sophisticated to the point that it takes a conscious effort to like it. And you know, there's this divide between those two extremes, and you know, that divide to a certain extent parallels, you know, the right and left political divide in America. It doesn't exactly parallel it, but I think almost all of these divides we see in the modern world can be in a way characterized as this sort of excessively sentimental or excessively rationalist ends of the spectrum. And Orthodox art, I think, can really help to heal that, because Orthodox art, you know, always expresses the bright sorrow. It's always got the mixture of the hope and joy in it, with the sobriety and the suffering in it, and it's always got the mixture of that, you know, intellectual sophistication, the Neoplatonic strain of Orthodox theology, with the sort of, you know, be like the little children strain of Christian theology. It always has those two things in it. And I want to talk a little bit about just some examples of Orthodox art that can kind of bring people together across that divide. This is from a series of frescoes painted by Anton Dyneko. These were painted at a church in Moscow, the Saint Antipas of Pergamon church, which is kind of has the reputation in Moscow of being the artist's parish. It's got a beautiful program of art and music there, and attracts a sort of a bohemian cultural crowd. And Anton decided to paint these amazing images on the walls that are almost grisaille. They're so pale that you can hardly even see them, but they have an incredible sophistication and refinement to them. And if you look at these images, these will be attractive to the most elite sophisticate you can imagine. A cultured atheist could not help but look at these images and see that this is art at the most serious level, and will treat these images with engagement and respect. But the images will also introduce to that person a spiritual content. These images, they solve this problem of the sophisticate who has difficulty connecting with religious art. And then another example, the sort of sweet Italianate strain of Orthodox iconography that comes out of 19th century Russia. It's fashionable for Orthodox people nowadays to kind of dismiss this kind of iconography, but I would encourage people to look at it more seriously. Not all of it is great art, but some of it I think is, and this example is. This is quite a beloved icon. This is Our Lady Quick to Hear at St. Tikhon's Monastery in Pennsylvania, and it has that very accessible, pretty quality that this romantic Russian iconography has, and therefore it's going to be very accessible to people who have a less sophisticated way of engaging with religious art. The Roman Catholic or the Protestant who's used to sort of sweet religious pictures will be able to immediately connect with this image. But this image also has profound spiritual content that shines through that sort of first impression of unsophistication. So this too is a way of bringing sort of the intellectual sobriety to people who might not used to be seeing that in religious art. And I'd like to end with a simple little icon painted by my friend Philip Davidoff, an iconographer from Russia, now living in the Republic of Georgia. And he is a intellectually sophisticated iconographer, and yet he has been working to paint in a childlike way. And I think this image is an example of an icon that could appeal to literally everyone. The sort of classical sophistication of this image is immediately obvious, but the childlike simplicity and the emotional appeal is equally immediately obvious. And I think in this image, we kind of can see a glimpse of a solution of how Orthodox art can bridge all of these intellectual and political divides, appeal to everyone at once.
Thank you.
So, my name is Jonathan Pageau, and I wasn't going to try to solve the world's problems with my images. So I usually talk about the meaning of things, but today I'm actually going to just show you the struggle, or not. It's a joyful struggle, the joyful struggle of trying to unite different strains of historical images. And so when I became Orthodox, I became Orthodox through a love of both the icon, but then also Western medieval traditions. And I had been denied that in school when we started learning about art history. It started at the Renaissance, and there was nothing before. And so it's kind of joy of discovering, Byzantine mosaics, but then also, art from Ireland, these amazing illuminations, and architecture from Norway. And so there's just to me, it was just so exciting to discover all these strains of images and types of representing that I just didn't have access to. And so for me, it wasn't even a question when I became Orthodox and I started moving towards the making of things. It was just obvious and inevitable that I just wanted to start to pull on these beautiful strains and try to create objects and images that would join them together in a way that was successful. Though I didn't want to create monsters in kind of strange hybrid things that look like pastiche, but hopefully trying to kind of pull them together towards synthetic images. And it was interesting because in meeting Andrew, I felt like we had similar ideas, not exactly the same, not exactly through the same strains, but this kind of desire to pull in different threads and then present something to someone that is at once, in some ways, something they've never seen before, but when they see it, they feel like they could have, they have seen it. Like Andrew's churches, they don't exist, those churches. These churches don't have actually historical precedent, but when you see them and when you enter into them, you feel like you're coming home like you would walk into an old castle or like you would walk into an old building. And so so it's something, it's a similar approach that I wanted to bring. And so I'm going to give you two examples of my work and try to show how I attempted to put that together, sometimes failing, I hope sometimes succeeding. So one of the images that when I started to study medieval art that I just loved was what we call the chase reliquary. And so this particular form of the reliquary that is like a little house, and you see it appear in Northern Europe, and you see it appear then in France, in different European strains. And I just really loved, there was something about that shape, almost like a microcosm of this little church or little building that now houses the relics of the saint. And so I always had the dream to be able to create something like that. There are different versions of them. Some are made of ivory, some are made of cloisonné enamel on metal. So the idea was, how can we do this today? How can we figure it out? And one of the solutions that I came to was the possibility of using wood as an intermediary structure. So there's this whole tradition of reliquaries that come from Cluny that you see in the different medieval collections that were using wood to bind ivory together in these reliquaries. And so I came up with this drawing, which is basically this kind of desire to create a chase reliquary that respects the kind of Irish insular art where it comes from, that there's a bit of a French sense to it. On the side of the reliquary, you can see there's these insular patterns that come from these Irish patterns of little beasts that are turning around, but using then Orthodox iconography. So the image that you see of Christ in the diocesis has the Mother of God and St. John the Foreigner, a sensibility that's more Byzantine in the iconography. And on the other side, you have the Anastasis. And so luckily I'd already met Andrew at this time. And so I showed him this drawing, and then he accepted to make the box. And it turns out it was very painful to make, if I remember correctly. But he did it. He made the wooden, he created like the technical drawing, because obviously this is all wrong, all the angles are wrong, everything's wrong about this. So Andrew was able to make a nice precise drawing about it. And one of the things that Andrew mentioned to me, and I should have listened to him, and this is where I failed in the image, is that he said, those kind of knot ornaments on the reliquary, they're too much. Like they're pushing it. They don't belong there. There's something about it that doesn't totally integrate into the reliquary. So when he made the box, he didn't put the wooden circles in there for me to put the ornament. But I was stubborn, and so I decided that I was gonna put them in there anyway. And so Andrew created the Bubinga box, beautifully made, and I made all the little panels of steatite, integrating them into the box. And I have to admit, now looking at it today, I definitely see that Andrew was right. And that the knotted ornaments that I included them, they look like a pastiche, like a biker tattoo or something, like something that's too much. It's like it's too strongly Celtic in a way, and it just doesn't jive with the rest of the object. But nonetheless, I mean, I think in general it's a successful object. I do like the way that the ornaments are inscribed on the side of the box. I feel like that was quite successful. But even here, if you see the Nativity and the Anastasis, you know, you get a sense that those ornaments definitely don't belong there. And so that is one example. I just wanted to show you to show how there's this desire. I do think it is, you know, if I would be happy to have a reliquary like that. You know, I think that it has enough success, but it was trying to push it too much in terms of the way that the different styles integrate together. What do you think? Do you agree, Andrew? And so I want to show you, a major example, but show you a few other examples where it's a constant thread in my work to try to find places where the East and the West connects in different ways. And so when I get commissions for statues, you know, from Western clients, then I will try to see, is it possible to integrate some of the Byzantine typology into the statuary? I know Aidan has done the same with some of his own statuary. So you can see that the way that the clothing is done is that it's actually a mix of some of the French kind of like Romanesque that is very geometric, but it also follows the form of a Byzantine icon. You can see the same with the Mother of God as the seat of wisdom. You know, there's something about the clothing and the face and the veil that is clearly coming out of Orthodox tradition, but the almost stiffer positioning of the Mother of God with the child and some of the stylization in the clothing is more Western in terms of its application, and the same with the crucifix. So you know, it's a Romanesque crucifix with a hint of Byzantine aspects, especially in the face, with a kind of gentler expression on the face, a kind of a sense that Christ is sleeping instead of a sense of anguish on him. So just a few more examples. So here, kind of playing with it. The thing about my work that's great is that the stakes of what I do are lower than Andrew, so I don't have to like focus this gigantic church that costs millions of dollars. Like it's going to succeed. You know, I can just make one icon and try something and see how it does. And so, you know, I've done several images where I try to push it, you know, to try to use, you know, Byzantine tropes of representing the face, but then represent Christ in almost like a Western king instead of a Byzantine emperor, you know, with the French crown and the signs of Western royalty. And the same with that little steatite Panagia there. That's it's based on an interesting steatite that is actually a Byzantine steatite. But when you look at this Byzantine steatite, it looks like something that was like made in Spain in the 11th century. It's so simple and geometric in the way that it's represented. So I thought it would be a very interesting thing to play with, to try to make an image that both had a face that would look like an image of the Mother of God and Christ, but then also in the clothing and in the almost abstract stylization of the figure of Christ that would kind of hearken to that kind of northern spirit of simplification. And this was made for actually a Russian priest that is in Spain, that has a mission in Spain, and Aidan has made several images for him. And so the final image I want to show is an image of Saint Michael and the dragon. This is like you could say a culmination of different images that we worked on, that Andrew and I worked on together over several years, trying to, I mean, for me, it was something like trying to create something that has never existed ever, but that somehow when you look at it, you could imagine it in the treasury, you know, of a 12th century treasury in Venice or something, or on Mount Athos. And so that image it's made out of steatite, and all the color is all stone. So there's no paint. The pink stone is a pink stone, and the blue stone is lapis, and it's all inserted into the image. It's actually based on a Gothic version of Saint Michael, but this, of course, the traits on Saint Michael, the way that he's portrayed, the way that his armor is made, harkens more to Byzantine and Eastern styles. And then I went really wild in the dragon. Now the dragon is based on Scandinavian art. And so the head of the dragon is based on the mast, how do you call that? The thing in front of a ship in English,
Masthead?
the masthead of a Scandinavian ship. And so here again, you have all the lapis, all the little pieces, or all these little pieces of lapis that are inserted into the dragon. And the background is made of basma, which is more of a Russian tradition. This was Andrew's idea. You know, a while ago, we had tried to make images similar to this and tried to gild the background. It didn't work, tried to leave it there, it didn't work. And then Andrew had this idea of using basma, which is not used in this way. It's not used in this manner. Usually basma replaces the background gilding of a painted icon. And so we kind of use it that way, but putting it in relationship with a relief icon this way is something that, I mean, I don't think, if it exists, I've never seen it. And then finally juxtaposing at the bottom of the image, a very kind of intense Scandinavian design of a dragon. And then at the top, you know, a far more usual image of the face of Christ not made with hands. And, you know, and when you look at the full image, you know, it's surprising. It's not, it's in some ways, it is not something that you would see every day. Oh, and then obviously the beautiful frame that Andrew designed in the way that he told you about. So this image, in some way, it's a crazy thing. It's a crazy object because it, you know, everything about it, like nothing about it is fully traditional. And I hope that everything about it is always also in some ways traditional. And trying to create that sense of an image that bridges both East and West, but also something which is new that also feels like you could have seen it in a museum. You know, so that is the way that at least I try to work on these questions. So wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm Aidan Hart. In case you're wondering why I speak strangely, I was raised in New Zealand. So I was a sculptor before I became Orthodox 40 years ago, so it was natural to start carving icons. This is what I did about 20 years after I became Orthodox, but it's an example of a wooden carved icon. When I was at a Aidan monastery, I was commissioned to make a casing for the Portaitisa icon. She's like the queen of Mount Athos. Other icons are allowed to go out for the faithful to venerate, but the Portaitisa doesn't. So she's like the queen of Athos. So it was a great honor to carve this casing. The theme running through a lot of my work is with every good iconographer and architect, is harmony and union, harmony between heaven and earth, between function and aesthetics, etc. So in this case, there are a lot of harmonies to come together. Aidan means Georgian. It was a Georgian monastery. So I included Georgian elements. So the column on the left, that's inspired by Georgian architectural columns, a very elongated capital, whereas the image on the right is drawn from early Greek carved works. In terms of the harmony in the relationship between the casing and the icon, I produced about 3 or 4 drawings for the abbot to look at. Some had quite simple casings and others were more complex. So it was a balance between making a casing that was worthy of the Queen of Heaven, so it couldn't just be a cardboard box. On the other hand, one that wasn't so baroque. You noticed the throne before the Queen sitting on it. So it was a union. And down below are scenes in the history of the icon. But there was another union that I had to work with. A lot of phorophoria offerings are made to the Mother of God, which are pressed silver hangings. So the glass had to be removed easily. So I had to make this quite complex mechanism, basically using wooden roller bearings. So the glass could be moved out to replace the phorophoria, but also the icon is taken out of this gate side chapel. Portatus means gatekeeper. So she's kept normally in a chapel next to the gate of the monastery, but 4 times a year she's taken out and put into the Catholicon. So I had to devise a mechanical system inside so it could be taken out without damaging it. So it's quite a challenge. These images show my parish church. It's an 8th century foundation. The existing church is 13th, 12th century. I frescoed the east wall, and that's inspired by early British iconography. Unlike America, we have a rich Orthodox tradition. Even though the Great Schism happened in 1054, you could say that the iconography up to about the 13th century is fully in the Orthodox tradition. So I drew from various elements. It's a new design, but it's drawing on various elements, including stained glass windows at Canterbury Cathedral. So the background of this is a sort of a light cream color, drawing on the existing walls. In fact, there are frescoes in this wall from 1380, the martyr of Thomas Becket. The icon screen I made there, the wooden icon screen, is made from oak. Some of it's 500 years old. We bought this church for the magnificent sum of £10. In fact, when we came to buy it, no one quite knew who owned it. The neighbouring farmer thought he owned it, and the Church of England thought they owned it. But for £10, they didn't go to court over it and pay lawyers £10 million. So they were commonsensical, and I forget which sold it to us. I think the Church of England. But anyway, when it was being restored, the builders were chucking up oak that was lying rotting on the ground. So I found inside this really rich oak. So I made it using techniques that are used in early medieval works. A lot of what's called the moulding. I used a scratch moulding method. Instead of using a router that just smashes through the grain, I made scratch moulding. And this goes with the grain to some extent and burnishes. And I just love, during prayer, sometimes looking at the light reflecting off this moulding, which is sort of ripples. Then I painted the icons. The altar here draws on various traditions, because about half of our parish are from Cyprus. So I drew on the Greek Cypriot tradition, but it's a foundation which is a daughter church of a convent nearby, which was founded in the 8th century. So at the moment they're the ruins of a 12th century church. So I found columns a bit like that and capitals like that. So that design was drawn on that. So I'm uniting here the Eastern and the Western Orthodox traditions, using local stone as well on the whole, except for the white Portland, which is about 200 miles away. There's another union is a practical need with aesthetic, and a new Orthodox work being put into an existing ancient church. So this is a parish church in Cambridge. It's right in the centre of Cambridge. It's left open most of the day for people to visit. An Anglican parish still uses it, and an Orthodox parish have permission to use it as long as they remove the icon screen after each service. So it was quite a challenge. It had to look permanent, the screen, but had to be easily removable, even by old ladies, just in case there weren't any young strapping men there. So I had quite a problem. So I first looked at what existed in that church, and there was on the right there, you can see in the middle, I'm folding the screen away there to show you what it looks like, but in the middle there, you can see a bit of wrought iron that already existed. So I made it out of wrought iron, and it can fold away. So in 30 seconds, it can disappear. But when it's closed, it looks as though it's been there forever. Also, some of the patterns and the painting of the iron below is inspired by a 19th century famous iron worker, where he would have subtly painted some elements of the wrought iron. So people would feel at home there from England. The icon, you can see in the middle of Christ, they are drawn on earlier, and I tended to go back earlier and earlier. This particular one was inspired by the nobility of 11th century Comnenian iconography. The next work, I was called in as a consultant to work being done in the Russian cathedral in London, Metropolitan Anthony Boone's Cathedral. And Russian oligarch was throwing a lot of money at the church. and the Archbishop, A, wasn't really fluent in English, so we couldn't brief the architects that well. And B, didn't have a really clear idea of what outcome he wanted. So the architects and the lighting engineers were not quite sure what atmosphere they were trying to create. And halfway through, the Archbishop wasn't that happy with the direction things were going. So he called me in to be a consultant, which most of the work had been done, but we worked on the lighting a little bit. But toward the end, he commissioned this work as a gift to the Patriarch of Russia. In this case, his brief was very good. I probably would have done it anyway, but even if, but anyway, he wanted archiepiscopal staff that reflected the Orthodox roots of Britain. So the roundels, the spheres there, one is inspired by Irish work, another by Anglo-Saxon, and another sort of later Romanesque, I think. And then the top part is inspired by an ivory work from about, I think, the 9th century. So one's trying to draw disparate or distinct elements, but create a unity, and I hope that worked. The next work, for various reasons, some of which I know, some of which I don't know, I've ended up working in a wide variety of media. I do mosaic as well, though I haven't got any pictures of that. So I do wood carving, stone carving, woodwork, fresco. About half my time is spent making panel icons, and quite a few of them of Western Orthodox saints. St. Cuthbert is a saint from Britain, 7th century saint. So here I've drawn on some elements of Romanesque, which is a bit later than Cuthbert, but the Romanesque period was where there was enough overlap of it. It was still an Orthodox worldview, but a certain stability in society that allowed really high-class iconography to be done. So I drew quite a bit on that, and also Anglo-Saxon illuminated manuscripts, the way the water goes. I call it sort of sacred comic book painting, where you're sort of playing around with things, with quite a bit of playfulness. So they show scenes in the light of St. Cuthbert. St. Cuthbert was found to be incorrupt for many centuries. They would open up his tomb and find him incorrupt, so they'd close it again. But finally, in 1819, when they last opened it, they found underneath many layers of garments the things that he's holding. One is a silver altar. So this is from his own time, about 700. There weren't many churches in his time. He was a missionary traveling monk. So he would go to a place and put the silver altar on, a rock, whatever, and celebrate the liturgy. So that was an antimensian. Behind that is the St. John's, the Gospel of St. John, and that's the oldest bound book in Western Europe. Perfect condition, found in his tomb. So I've included things that every British person would probably recognize as part of his life. The last images are of 2 frescoes I've done. The top one, I can't tell you in whose chapel that is. He doesn't want me to let people know, but I've rooted that in place. There's a harmony between place and liturgy. So around the bottom are flowers that grow outside a few meters away. The commissioner has a wildflower meadow. So this is the Mother of God in heaven, Our Lady of the Sign. You've got cherubim and seraphim there, but down below you've got flowers. So this is a theological statement that the Mother of God is in heaven, but also she's on earth, and it's in a womb-shaped place. It strikes me how in the liturgical text we don't say, let us think of the Transfiguration 2,000 years ago. Let us imagine that we are there. It says, no, today Christ is transfigured. Today Christ is born. This tension between chronos and kairos, divine time and clock time. The bottom wall painting is of the Transfiguration for the Lancaster Catholic chaplaincy. Another union that one must try to harmonize is the shape that you've got to work with. In this case, it's an unusual shape for the Transfiguration. It's a landscape shape. Most icons of the Transfiguration, of course, are portrait. So I had a challenge how to make something look as though it was always meant for that shape. but also the congregation. We didn't want the figures to be standing right to the end because the people sitting down at the front would have this towering figure over them. So we wanted people to participate in the transfiguration. So gradually I stepped things down. Sometimes it's a practical need for something. In this case, I wanted it balanced, but there are only 6 people and Christ is in the center. So you have a gap on the right. So I put a tree there, but I won't go into it, but it has a symbolic meaning. Along the bottom, there are birds and animals and plants that are local to that place. So again, the whole idea, and it's a curve, so it embraces the congregation. I wanted to show that Christ is transfigured today. So in the middle is Christ, not just the transfigured Christ in the past, but Christ present today. And this is reinforced by the local flora and fauna down below. Thank you.
I think we feel that applause was recognizing the cumulative power of the art that we saw and the very, very thoughtful reflections that accompanied it. And I heard us restraining ourselves from applauding after each one, but I think everybody felt the love in the room. Dr. Schroeder, do you have a opening comment or a thought or?
I'll keep the privilege of having one. First, thank you to the 3 of you for this wonderful insight into your work. It's the dream of every art historian and every art historical student. What is the artist's intent? What does the artist mean? And in the Middle Ages, we don't know. We can only guess, and we rarely know the names. So it's a privilege to listen to 3 of you enlightening us as to how you mobilize tradition, your skills, and all these materials. But I wanted to ask you something that I would never ask my students. How do you feel about actually engaging with such a formidable tradition like the one of the Orthodox Church? I wouldn't say necessarily only Byzantine. What does it mean for you, each of you personally, to be in line with that tradition?
Well, I think I am perhaps not as fearful as I maybe ought to be if I were a wiser person. I tend to just, throw myself right into art and do what seems right to me and not worry too much about whether what I'm doing is dangerous. The Orthodox Church, if it has a fault, its fault is that it's overly cautious. And all 3 of us have run into this problem in our careers, that anything an Orthodox artist might do that's not exactly perfectly normative looking, there will be a certain number of people who just say it's wrong, even that it's heretical or immoral, because it's not perfectly what the Orthodox Church is accustomed to. I've never allowed this to, stop me doing what I want to do. I think it's, fortunately, people generally seem to like and accept the work that I do. So I guess I'm hitting the target of just the right amount of sort of creativity and innovation without going too far. But I would say, interestingly, that problem of people being afraid of innovation within Orthodoxy has mostly evaporated over the 18 years that I've been doing this. I'd be interested to hear if Jonathan and Aidan have also observed this, but we together founded the Orthodox Arts Journal all those years ago, largely as a sort of platform for the polemics of justifying creativity and innovation within Orthodox liturgical art. because we found that there was so much pushback against that. But I kind of feel like that's become an old problem. Like nowadays, I kind of feel like, when we talk to, our fans and supporters, they're always pushing us, go further, do something even more creative, something with even more Western influence. And, I showed you two of the churches I designed early in my career that are, quite overtly rooted in Byzantine architectural forms. Some of the churches I've designed more recently don't have domes. They have hardly anything that's really recognizable as Byzantine architectural style. They're going to be very good, beautiful churches that functionally support the Orthodox liturgy very well, and they're going to support the sort of liturgical aesthetic of Orthodoxy very well, but they don't cling to these external trappings of Imperial Byzantium nearly as much as people kind of demanded in my work years ago, and people seem to be far more comfortable with that now. So I think things are getting better for us in terms of being able to draw freely from our cultural backgrounds, mix that up with what we find interesting, not just in Byzantium or Moscow, but in maybe the more obscure little corners of Orthodox history, maybe the quasi-Orthodox corners of history, like Romanesque England, for instance. And choose for ourselves what we think is the right thing to do, and for the most part, people seem to trust our judgment in that.
Well, Andrew, I think though, you're kind of pushing hard on this direction, but I think one of the reasons why this has happened is because people have learned to trust you, and in some ways trust us, because what they've seen is a deep love of these forms. And so the type of innovation that you propose are very different from the types of innovations we saw in the 1960s and 70s that happened in the architecture. And I think that the fear that a lot of the commissioners have is that they saw the disaster of, these insane modern spaceship looking churches, and they don't want that. And so I think that, like, you've earned their trust. It's like, no, I'm not going to give you some insane thing. I'm going to give you something that has a love for tradition, a love for the liturgy, and I'm going to maybe push your expectations, but know that I do this really out of love of the church and love of these forms. So I think that's why it's happening the way it is. So anyway, that's the way that I see it.
But it's more than just YouTube.
No.
They're trusting more than, YouTube played a really important role by creating stunning art and through the writing in Orthodox Arts Journal. But all of the effects you're feeling there and the opinions that you're pooling there reflect a much wider
There's
phenomenon.
something happening. Yeah, something
Right.
happening.
Yeah. Am I right?
No, I think
Okay.
you're right. I think you're right. At least for me, for me, discovering medieval art and discovering Byzantine art, it was a solution to my problems. And my problems as a contemporary artist, as someone studying contemporary painting, and becoming extremely alienated by the forms, by the possibility of expressing something true and real and beautiful within that context. Both the context of the gallery itself as a strange, alienated space of either purchasing or just this kind of distance looking, and at the same time, the very forms of contemporary art, which were ironic and almost removed, and just comments on comments on comments. And so for me, it was like a kid in a candy store. That's how I felt when I have the chance to do this. Like, I'm allowed to do this. I can make a reliquary. What? Like, I thought that was impossible. I thought nobody was allowed to do that anymore. And so for me, it was just this, this almost like a jubilant discovery of all these things, and all these quirky images and all these things, trying to bring them together in a way that was acceptable for the participation in the life of the church. And so I also have never felt this daunting feeling. I've just felt excitement at being able to do it, and then being surprised that people would commission these things and that I could make them for churches and for people. And yeah, that's mostly how I approached it. And even, because being an icon carver is just not a thing. Like it doesn't exist. And so just the fact that I can do this is so crazy that all I can do is rejoice and just move forward. So that's been the way that I've approached it.
Yeah, and I agree with Jonathan that on the one hand, the tradition is just so high and exalted. It's all inspiring. On the other hand, it's a relief in a way. It means that the burden is not on you. Personally, I became a Christian when I was 15, Baptist initially. But I remember reading the scriptures in the passage where the Lord says to Moses, the Lord has given to Moses the pattern for the tent of meeting. And he says, I've given my spirit, put my spirit and spirit of wisdom and ability and all manner of skills upon, what's his name? Bezalel, yeah, to make the tent of meeting. And I don't remember many prayers from my youth. I used to pray a lot. I do remember then, just please, Lord, give me that gift. I want to serve you and serve people with that gift. So 10 years later, when I became Orthodox, that's 40 years ago now, it's as though the Lord said, here's the pattern. This is how you're to make the tent of meeting. So for me, it was an answer to prayer. So it's that sense of rejoicing. The Lord has shown me the pattern, as it were. And I've been a sculptor before that as a Christian, but working more on the human person, modeling faces. So that was like a skill preparation. But here, the temple pattern was revealed to me. So my experience of the tradition since then has been that before that, I could do whatever I wanted, as it were, as a sculptor, because I wasn't working liturgically. So the freedom was horizontal, and I enjoyed that. But here, the freedom was vertical in the sense that, there's really high exalted tradition up here. So the freedom wasn't so much left and right, though there is that latitude, and variation in style, but it was just to reveal more and more the eternal mystery and wonder of God's love. So in a sense, the aim was higher, but the help was greater, because it's like you're standing on other people, sitting on other people's shoulders.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Several things united your three presentations, and some of you even spoke about some of these things, namely love for the church, love for Christ, love for and a reverence for the work. Even in your recent response, Andrew, even yes, you are more emboldened to do certain things, but never without reverence and love. Also, what I'm hearing is a profound pastoral sensibility that the local place, the context is such an important part of the picture. And each of you in your own ways have shown beautifully tonight how sometimes with struggles, Jonathan, thank you for being open about that, that you've worked to account for context. And I think that's part and parcel of tradition, whether it's tradition within theological expression or within any of the arts. The stuff follows context. Where the church travels, so does the art. So do the words, so does the language. That's just part of how it works. And that's because the artists themselves are in perhaps a new context, and the people who are praying are in that context. And you want that to mesh. So all of that said, I think there's one thing that left me a bit perplexed, and I kind of heard two tendencies vis-a-vis the West. And on the one hand, sort of the invitation to kind of find the best things from within Western culture. And then certainly Western culture is the context within which we're creating art. And so there's a kind of a welcome of the best of the West. And then, but I was also hearing, maybe especially from you, Andrew, a tendency to sort of posit Orthodox art, which is a very big thing. I don't know any of us could say what is Orthodox art, kind of as against the worst examples of Western artistic expression. And that just felt maybe a little unfair, like, let's compare our ideals to their ideals and our failures to their failures. And that's kind of a more fair conversation to have in a way.
Well,
I might have misunderstood you.
the polarization to the two extremes of sentimentality and sort of intellectual rationalism, I'm not sure that's a Western problem as much as a modern problem. You know, obviously, if we look at the 20th century art of the Soviet Union, for instance, it exhibits that exact polarization to a similar extreme. And it's a modern problem that emerged a long time ago. You know, I'd say perhaps with the Renaissance, arguably, that if we look at medieval art, you know, of West or East, medieval art was all fundamentally liturgical, and it all exhibited that bright sorrow fusion where it had spiritual sobriety, but it also had sort of a childlike joy and a light shining through it. But that beautifully liturgical and Christian union that all medieval art, Eastern and Western, exhibited, they started to break apart post-Renaissance into sort of popular sentimental art and intellectual high art.
Or even just industrial
Mhm.
production
Yes.
and the idea of fine art. There's all these weird opposites that appear in the development of modernism, where the idea of a craftsman is almost something that's based. And the artist is someone who aims high and makes these images that don't have a function and are just to contemplate from outside. But there's all these opposites that appear in liturgical art. I think Andrew's point, and I think he's completely right, is that one of the things that Orthodox liturgical art has the capacity to do today is to bridge all of those divides, actually. Because when you make an image, or if you make an icon, that icon is not there just to be looked at in a gallery. It actually is there to participate in the prayer life of someone. If you make a beautiful chalice or a beautiful lampada, it's the same question. You're aiming at something very high in terms of what it's doing, even in terms of philosophically what its role is in the liturgy and how it's related to all these very, very, high concepts. But then it's also something that if you swing the censer, you have to, it actually participates in the life of people. And so just as much in terms of this excess that happened in modern art, and it's really radical, by the way, they're so radical and so ridiculous sometimes, these opposites. If you think of contemporary art movements, if you think of, for example, conceptual art and minimalist art, if you didn't know and you went into a gallery and I told you that's conceptual art and that's minimalist art, you would have thought those two are the same thing. But those people they fought each other like crazy because they were actually, one was completely reductionist in its materiality, and the other one was thinking this is high Platonic kind of abstractions, but they ended up actually looking the same in their extreme opposition. And the wonderful thing about liturgical art is that it bridges all these divides into a powerful, metaphysically directed, practical thing that you can engage in your life.
Yeah, my own approach to, and I think we must distinguish it between liturgical art, which has a very specific function, and let's just call it gallery art. So I agree entirely with you. One can't judge this other art from the same point of view of liturgical art. So I'm a bit of an optimist and a half glass full person. So when I look at art, I just looking for good that is there. I don't pretend there's good when there isn't good. But even if someone like a Monet, who's not interested as far as in spiritual values, he was interested in the way the color interacted with form and produced some incredible work. It just happens that light is an image of God, and the form, the flowers or the water that is bouncing off, is the created material world. So you immediately got this interaction of light and form. Now he might be coming to certain conclusions just because he wants to create an impression of light mingling with form and without a religious import. But because he's working with icons, basically, light and form are icons of higher things, then to me, it touches me deeply. So I think we live in the West. If we just sort of complete bash it, and I think of that sort of art as philosophy. it's people searching for something. But we're made in God's image and we're created for union with him. And if people reject God, they're still hungry beings. They're still thirsting for something. They'll probably look in the wrong place, but nonetheless, underneath that is a thirst for something. So I think it's important to have an affirmative, though discerning approach to a lot of this modern art. And I've sort of written a bit on this matter. I suppose I've been in the world earlier as a sculptor, doing what these people are sort of searching through my art. So I think there is work that I call compassionate work, like Giacometti, the sculptor. He knows man is lonely, secular man is lonely. He depicts loneliness, but with compassion. Whereas Francis Bacon, he sees the tragedy of human life and sort of revels in it. So they see the similar suffering, but respond in completely different ways. And I don't think you can reject or throw both of them into the bin. Both see the same tragedy, but they react in different ways. So I think I don't like rejecting modern art so it's one big lump. It isn't. I think each work's got to be discerned. And I think we're often said we're in the same period as the apologists. The apologists were in a predominantly non-Christian atmosphere with all sorts of philosophies around. They didn't just reject all Greek philosophy, they discerned it. So some of it was half truth and they'd fill it out, and some was just to be rejected. So in a sense, I think we live in a similar period. Needs discernment, but to be as affirmative as possible. And what's lacking, just top it up.
The need to discern, and also the Christian imperative to welcome and invite through beauty.
But don't get all that messed up with liturgical art. I think you get some modern architects who want to be really modern, Orthodox architects, very modern. And I don't think they're sort of discerning enough. I mean, it's good that they're trying and doing something different. They're not acting by fear. But I think, we're just going to be really quite careful of the interface of the two.
Yeah, we have it. I mean, I think we have an example with Father Gregory Krug of someone who did it successfully, and in some ways there is something about his imagery that is experimental, but he is able to, when you look at his painting, you'll see it's obviously influenced by modern art. There's no doubt about it, but there is still a deep respect for the tradition of iconology and certain aspects of the way that the Russian image was painted. And so it ends up being, I mean, I would venerate an icon by him. No, I would have no qualms about it. And what happens, for example, in people like Seraphim O'Keefe, he takes Father Gregory and he pushes it more. He refines some of the experimental things that Father Gregory did, and then you almost have this again. It's like lifting up, like Matisse, and kind of slowly lifting them up towards something that is now transfigured. And so I think it's definitely possible to do with discernment. Father Silouan is doing similar things with modern contemporary color theory, where he's using push and pull and different chromatic effects, which the ancients, would not have used. Certain types of color schemes that the ancients would not have used, but doing it in a subtle way that integrates integrates into communion, and people recognize them as icons.
Did Father Silouan Justiniano, whom you just referred to, is here? I'd love to invite you to comment in any way or ask anything, just as an artist yourself.
Peter organizing this with the
Okay,
Start again.
I'd like to thank you and Rosita for organizing the event and for the Institute of Sacred Arts, which has been playing a very important role in raising awareness for all these issues which we need to discuss. And I'm glad in particular for this discussion, because it does raise the important topic of how we as Orthodox Christians engage the West from our very immediate contexts today. And the three panelists, Andrew, Jonathan, and Aidan, are foremost examples of how that could be done creatively. I think one of the things that was brought up that I think needs to be underlined is the importance of context and the great opportunity that we have here in the United States and in Europe at this moment. Two places that have been pretty much not formed by Orthodoxy. The West partly but since the Great Schism has been more and more estranged from Orthodoxy, so that you don't really see an indigenous form of Orthodox art to pretty much serve as the primary language that you take for granted as artisans or painters or architects. And so in that sense, the irony is that the secular contexts that we have been given or we've been born into through the grace of God these contexts create the freedom and self-awareness that could be daunting at times, but at the same time very healthy for the life of the church, because you are examples of how you could basically pull from all these various traditions and reach out for a synthesis that is pretty much predicated on our understanding of Pentecost, where the Holy Spirit was given to the church. And Aidan Hart wrote a very interesting article a while back called The Pentecost of Styles, where he discusses how in each local tradition you have a way of engaging the tradition via the very unique temperament of the culture. And so similarly with our immediate historical predicament, that's what's happening now. And so one thing that I think, and you're a good examples of that, another thing, I have one question in the end, but another observation that I think is important, which I have in the course of like a few years. I started collaborating with Jonathan and Andrew since I think 2014 or something like that, under the radar, behind the scenes, writing, contributing articles for Orthodox Art Journal. And at first I was very much in a spirit of what I would call like a reactionary, like traditionalism, which basically went at things in a black and white kind of like attitude towards modern and contemporary art. And that has sort of like eventually shifted slightly towards a more nuanced understanding, as Aidan explained it just now. And I think one of the important things that we have to keep in mind as liturgical artists is to not to be too facile in imposing, which goes back to your comment, Peter, imposing standards that we take for granted within the liturgical context into a non-liturgical context of gallery art. And also going at it with the spirit of discerning the good, because the fact that every single human being has the image and likeness of God imprinted in them. And so even if inadvertently, even if it's a minimalist or a conceptualist or an abstract expressionist or like, even a crazy postmodern contemporary artist, you will find strains that are actually it betray a desire for the divine, or a desire for qualities that are in conjunction with our own metaphysical understanding of reality from an Orthodox perspective and theology. So that's one thing. I guess the last thing to add to that is how, and a question for all the panelists, I sometimes experience sort of like like if I'm given a commission, one of the last commissions that I did was for an iconostas. And there is a tendency for people to think that they know what traditional iconography is, okay? And a lot of this comes from like stuff that they've gathered, in literature that has been given to them in catechism that pretty much was shaped by the pioneers of the mid-20th century. And when you don't have an artistic, mindset or a larger perspective, it becomes kind of like that black and white kind of like attitude, which is primarily identifying the liturgical art of the church with Byzantine art, along the lines of a very like indigenous cultural identity approach. And so how, I guess, would you recommend to deal with that from a really pastoral context where when way when dealing with commissions, how have you in the past and how do you still deal with opening people's minds as to how the liturgical tradition is not to be defined by one of the tongues that were shed in Pentecost, but there's multiplicity of tongues. And so we have to aim towards the unity and diversity, which is what the Catholicity of the church is. That's basically.
Thank you.
Well, if I can talk a little about my own work, a lot of, to answer your last question, a lot of it's simply education, to simply show people examples from lesser known corners of Orthodox history, show the remarkable diversity that existed, and in particular to try to help people understand that oftentimes those differences one sees in the historical record can be explained by geographical and cultural differences of the different places that produced the art. And then that can help, loosen people up a little bit to understand that, art is not, the art of the church is not sort of handed down by God like the Ten Commandments and like that's what we're stuck with forever because God handed it to us. It did not work that way. The art was an expression of native cultures, which very often were doing that art before they were Christian. And then when they became Christian, they continued doing their style of art or their style of building, in the context of Christian worship. And furthermore, just in terms of sort of the history of liturgical ceremony and liturgical objects, 95% of what we do in church pre-exists Christianity. Just the ceremonial things that make up church services, they go back to Judaism and they go back to ancient Greek worship, and you can go into the Egyptology section of your art museum and you can see all the same processional fans and, bishop staffs and icons and, holy doors. All of that stuff existed in pagan religions thousands of years before Christianity. So it's not like Christians invented any of these things. They're sort of universal, human ways of engaging with the sublime, however that religion might envision that, and that we need to be able to do that, freely through what culturally makes sense to us. I think people can be educated to see that, but it's really a matter of sort of art historical education. People need to have that context. And of course, a lot of modern young Americans don't have any of that context at all. They kind of convert to Orthodoxy often from knowing almost nothing about anything cultural or historical. And, the Orthodox Church thus finds itself in the odd position of not just educating people about Orthodoxy, but educating people about everything. And that's kind of, I think that's a bit of a new problem for Orthodox churches. It's a new pastoral problem. It's one I've been seeing with a lot of the, the latest sort of crop of converts coming to our churches is different. 15 or 20 years ago, they were typically practicing Christians who already knew a lot, converting from another denomination to Orthodoxy. Now they're mostly people who come from no religious background and know nothing at all about religion. And that simply teaching those people about what the Orthodox Church does is not adequate. You have to teach them about what humans do and always have done.
And so I have to admit that I have had less of that problem myself because I carve icons and already icon carving is not a thing. And so whoever commissions carving for me is already not going to have that extremely strict vision of what icons are. And so I've been very, in some way it wasn't planned. This wasn't like a plan, but in some ways I find myself in a very, very nice position, which I chose and, was kind of guided into an art which is marginal to the Orthodox tradition. It's there, it's real, but it's marginal. And that's actually probably why I was able to do it, because I also had no competition but it means that I in some ways have been more free to explore because nobody knows what a carved face of an icon looks like. There's so much variability, there's so much variation. And so I've had quite a bit of freedom to be able to explore different forms and bring them together.
Yes, I don't often have that problem myself, but I can think of two. One was a potential problem. I was commissioned to make a stone icon screen for the Russian church in Amsterdam. And it was a basilica. And a great deal of the parish was Russian, and they expected 5-tiered wooden screen. It was pretty clear that that wouldn't work in this place. We had a 1-tiered stone screen, really fitting in with the basilica design. But before we actually presented the designs that Father Hilda and I thought were appropriate, about 6-7 months, Father Hilda did a series of talks going back to education, which Andrew was speaking of, really showing them the history of the icon screen. And then they realized, actually, it's not just the 16th century Russian icon screen that was traditional. There wasn't even an icon screen for centuries. There was a screen up to the 11th century with no icons. That was the norm. And then they started having icons. So when we came to present what we thought was probably the best design, everyone was happy with it. This icon here was commissioned by a man who, not particularly devout and Anglican, he's really into history, and he wanted me to put tons of information about the life of St. Cuthbert, and he wanted it quite naturalistic. So I found you've got to discern between what they want, but how to do it. So when they mix up what and how, they tell you what they want and how to do it. That's the problem. So I found you can be pastorally positive by saying, yeah, I think what you want is really good. He didn't want us to picture Cuthbert. He wanted to tease out his life as well. I thought, that's great, let's go for it. I think we can do it in a better way than what you're thinking of. And then it's interesting, he did commission a naturalistic painter to do a scene of various scenes from the life of another British saint, and they're side by side. And the other painter said, oh, I wish I had the freedom to do what Aidan does, because you can say so much more with this more sacred cartoon approach. So then initially not so keen on my approach, the commissioner said, actually, I realize now, the how is a lot better this way than that. So I think that the trick is to discern what they want, which is normally good, but just gently suggest better ways of how to do it. So actually in the end, I feel, thank goodness you suggested a better way.
We are technically at time, but we've gotten the okay to take 1, max 2 short questions from the audience here. I'm also going to be emailed a couple of questions online. We'll try to be brief about it to respect everybody's time. I will also tempt you with the prospect of a nice reception downstairs for those of you who are on site. So keep your questions brief and you'll have more time to sip Prosecco. Anyone? If the questions can be succinct and answerable, that'd be great.
So I'm a graphic designer and I do 99% of my work is digital. And I was wondering if you had any ideas about how digital art could be incorporated into Orthodox art.
I think you might be the one because you're involved in graphics. Sort of,
Yeah, to me, it's all about, I have a way of seeing the world that it's just everything is a hierarchy. And so I think that digital art is an inevitable aspect of Orthodox art today. And anybody who doesn't think that hasn't gone on an Orthodox website. Obviously, it's part of our world. And I think the best way to approach digital art is to understand its place, for example, in the digital sphere already, or if it's going to be included on certain objects or certain things, it has to be well thought out in terms of where it's going to be placed. And at the same time, I think there are ways to, for example, source ornaments, source colors, there are things that you can source from within the tradition, which when they are now represented digitally will fit. And I think that's true of websites, for example. There are some parish websites which when you look at them, there's some liturgical feeling to them. A good example is, of course, the amount of pain we went through to design the Orthodox art show. And luckily we had Andrew, who was like a, how can I say this? He wouldn't budge, like he just knew what he wanted. But it was really an effort that took like a year to get to the right design in order to find a digital space that was a digital space in which you could engage that would give you a hint of of liturgical life. Obviously, it's not that, but that it kind of it draws you into, and it has something about the way that even that the columns were placed and the manner in which everything was set up on the page, it would give you that sense that you're almost looking at like an old manuscript, but not in a pastiche way, but something that was. So I think it's definitely possible, but it's not easy because the digital world, in some ways, there's so many shortcuts that it's, that's why a lot of parish websites look horrible too.
I'd like to just, there's a couple of wonderful questions online. One addresses music, and I would really encourage you to involve yourself in our summer music institutes, which treat exactly these kinds of east-west adaptation kinds of questions. So there's also a fascinating question, which would really be addressed, I guess, especially to you, Aidan. I was raised and live in Hawaii, where the native culture did not have advanced architectural ability before European contact. It's hard to compare simple stick frame thatched roofed huts with impressive European churches. Likewise, iconography to a culture that has had no painting. They did have carving. Nonetheless, there is a particular cultural style. How can there be any continuity between such disparate traditions? What would an authentic Orthodox expression look like for native Hawaiians? Perhaps Aidan would have better insight, having grown up around the Maori.
Thank you. Yes, the pre-Christian Maoris were basically, hesitate to use the term ancestor worshippers. There was a continuity there. So the heart of the tribal life was what's called the Maori pa. You can imagine a basilica without the apse at the end, just a simple building. And that is the gathered together body of all your ancestors. So the door was the mouth of the single body. The one window was the eye of the ancestor. The ridge pole of the building was the spine, and the beams coming down with the ribs, and then you had the columns, and the ancestors were carved on the columns. So what do you think it is? A church. You've got your church. And in fact, the original Christian missionaries, Anglicans, perceived that. So the earliest churches were adapted Maori pas, when with our iconographic background, we couldn't do it better. So I've always loved the life of St. Nicholas of Japan. If you don't know his life, do read it. But I think it's about 7 years. All he did was to study Japanese culture, and only then, having, as it were, listened to the word of the Lord revealed to the Japanese, only then did he start speaking. And because of that, because he drew on the virtues already that existed, when the Japanese-Russian war broke out and he had to leave, the faith remained strong because they hadn't converted to Russia, they converted to Christ, and by a man who respected what it was already revealed in their culture.
I just want to point out that there have been thatched roof churches that have existed for centuries in Ethiopia, Lake Tana, and they're huts, basically round huts that have thatched roof, thatched outside, but they've been liturgical spaces for centuries.
I can imagine how uncomfortable it would be to build a concrete church in that hot climate. I've lived in a concrete building in Thessalonica, and it's not a nice experience. In the middle of summer, you might as well go to bed in an oven and turn the oven on.
Christ is risen.
Last question. Ian Davey is risen.
I am not an artist, but I am a pastor, and I have a big concern about one thing that you mentioned. And Andrew, I've spoken to you about it, actually. You were very favorable and positive about all various forms of art. However, there is certain times where art is not in a gallery. It obtrudes Orthodox art from flourishing and beautiful art from flourishing. For instance, a designed church from the 60s that is, a spaceship. An iconostasis that is, maybe not conducive to worship. Is there any place, and do you have any advice especially if there are pastors or future pastors here, for how you treat that art, because sometimes, in my opinion, it has to be removed in order to make way for beautiful art, but I don't know if that is respectful, and I don't know how an artist would see that and how you progress from how you deal with these architecturally.
Well, I am faced with that practical problem quite often. A number of times, priests from churches built in the 60s to the 80s in an overtly modern, typically sort of spaceship style of modernism, reach out to me and say, we have money to beautify our church. What do we do about that? We have a contingent of sort of Byzantinists in the parish who want to, sort of cover it all with styrofoam and aluminum Byzantine domes and try to conceal the fact that it's a modern style building. And I personally am very much against that, because there's nothing sort of magically holy about the Byzantine style. Byzantine churches are wonderful churches, mostly because of how they're built, because they're solid masonry, because they have thick walls, because they're well proportioned, because they're plastered, because they're frescoed. It's these intrinsic qualities to how they're built that makes them such good churches. The sort of superficial stylistic elements, that they have tiles on the domes or that the windows have arched tops. There's nothing about that that's better than another style. It's just the style that happens to be the style that prevailed in the medieval, Byzantine Empire. But stylistic integrity, that is to say that the building speaks with one voice, is more important than the best choice of style. So, yes, of course, I wouldn't design a building in a 60s spaceship style from scratch. But if a church has a building in that style, and it's an honest example of that style with consistency and integrity, putting a sort of Byzantinist gloss onto that building is not going to make it a better building. It's not going to improve its proportions. It's not going to improve its materials. It's only going to water down its stylistic integrity, which sort of by definition means it's going to make it uglier, because one of the qualities of beauty is that the whole ensemble speaks with one voice. I often visit churches like that and try to encourage the people there to recognize that there actually are elements of quality in those buildings. There's often a very good symmetry to those structures. They're often quite solidly built compared to contemporary buildings. If you actually go down to the details of like the bronze doors and the door hinges and the light fixtures and the floor tiles, oftentimes these actual materials with which 1960s churches are built are far superior to what you typically see in contemporary construction. They have a lot of the the good quality of 19th, early 20th century construction kind of lingered well into the modern era. So I think those churches just have to make a decision. If they're going to stick with that building, that's the style they have, and they have to make the best of it, treat it respectfully. They might decide they want to, mothball that as a historic relic and build a whole new church next to it. That's a legitimate choice also. But I'll also tell you, I feel the same way about the sort of Italianate romantic style of iconography in churches of the late 19th, early 20th century vintage. When you look at a church, built circa 1890, 1910 in, say, Pennsylvania or Alaska, for instance, and it's in that sort of wedding cakey, neoclassical style, a lot of Rococo wood carving, painted white with gold highlights, and it's got an old iconostasis of that vintage, and it has the romantic Italianate style icons in it. I see a consistency and integrity to that presentation. It's the style of the time, and it's not the style we would choose now, but there's a beauty in the consistency of that. And I don't actually like it when churches tear out those icons and put in very modern Greek Neo-Byzantine icons. It's discordant with the architecture, it's discordant with the color scheme. So I think, you know, I just wish, I wish Orthodox people would get over some of the stylistic chauvinism that like it's holy because it's Byzantine or it's holy because it looks Russian. That's nonsense. You know, things are holy because they're beautiful and they're consistent and they support the liturgical needs of the church.
Just one thing, you know, I can't help but say that in fact, stylistic discordancy, I'm not sure is characteristic that can be found in Byzantine churches.
Mm.
You look at Asina in Cyprus, which has frescoes from the 12th and 14th century. Nobody cared of covering the 12th century and updating into the 14th. So what I'm trying to say is that the church could speak with different voices stylistically in that respect, you know, and can have, and I think that ultimately what happens is that maybe you can educate people into the stylistic, what is it, like symphonia that's happening in the
Yes.
church in order to point out to them, because sometimes we have lost the sensibility to be able to identify it.
Well, yeah, I don't mean to say that you can't take a 20th century church and do interventions to make it more beautiful, but just that those interventions need to prioritize harmony with what exists over a narrow-minded stylistic
That's
preference.
true.
But do you believe that there were legitimate reasons to try to move away from the Italianate kind of romantic neoclassical style and try to recover a more Byzantine and medieval language of iconography?
Yes, yes. I mean, I'm sure we all agree that, you know, a more medieval style of liturgical art is a richer and fuller expression of orthodoxy than the Italianate manner, for sure. And that goes for architecture as well as iconography. I mean, although I think, you know, although I think those old churches should be preserved, I don't think we should build in that style as our first choice.
I think aesthetically we might agree, but I'm comfortable saying that, you know, orthodoxy is better when it's Byzantine, you know,
Well,
or,
of course.
you know, or older.
Yeah,
You
but
know,
the thing is that it did happen. That is,
Yeah.
the reason why I am an icon cover is because that happened. Because some people at the mid-20th century decided to recover something that they felt had been lost.
Mhm.
Without that, there's no way I'd be an icon cover. Why would I, right? That it would just be another version of Catholic art. And I wouldn't care. Like, I just wouldn't care. I would not be doing it. I wouldn't be.
Likewise, I would not have converted to Orthodoxy if the Orthodox Church were still prioritizing the construction of sort of Rococo revival architecture painted white and gold. It would never have appealed to me.
Aesthetically.
Yes, aesthetically.
Mhm.
But
No, but I think,
yeah,
but it's not
I-
just, it's more than
It's
aesthetic.
more than that,
It's
yeah.
more than aesthetic. It's because there is a sense in which you're entering into a worldview that is different.
Exactly.
And so it's not just an aesthetic choice, it's also there is an aspect which is to declare in some ways that something went off. And I don't know when exactly, you know, and some people have different opinions about when things kind of started going wrong. But I have a sense that something went off, and some of the fruits of the world today are part of something going off at some point. And that has different aspects. There's theological aspects to that. There's aspects related to the mystical prayer life. And some of it is also related to the visual language of the church and the liturgical language of the church. And so it's hard because you look at what happened in the mid-20th century and the people who recovered this language. Some of it was kind of, it was a little awkward and it was a little maybe too forceful. And there's all that for sure that we could criticize about what happened. But nonetheless, you know, whatever revival and whatever, let's say, whatever is going on now in terms of people converting to Orthodoxy, which is the weirdest thing ever in America, is part of a sense of trying to recover something that at some point went wrong. And so it doesn't mean to be idiosyncratic and to be just nostalgic, but I think it's important, at least for me, it was definitely important in kind of recovering this language. So.
Yeah, wouldn't you situate it though also within a broader cultural phenomenon, you know, whether it's music or art or architecture, where you have classical, and you have modern and neoclassical, and then, these are phases, they're swings of a pendulum that I think, I guess I keep pushing back against claiming all this for orthodoxy, and rather seeing it just as a much broader global phenomenon in culture. And perhaps it's natural. I think we do agree in many cases around the table about what we would gravitate towards, aesthetically, but it's bigger than us,
Oh, yeah.
The way I see it, I like to link aesthetics with asceticism, with ascetics, the inner nature of the human person. If we just talk about cultural things and styles, it's all subjective. But when you're making a work of liturgical art, it might take 5 days, but probably about 1,000 little decisions you've got to make about color. And always I try to refer back to what state of soul am I trying to engender in the person. It's an icon of Christ, and that's the important thing. But the way it's painted is going to have an impression, like the lighting. If we turn the lighting down, put it up, it does something to you directly. So Baroque for me, I mean, I love it. In some ways, it's just like sort of Disneyland bling, but it's more difficult to pray in a church like that than, I don't know, in a monastic church with rich, deep colors that quieten your soul, that give you a sense of ecstasy, and that concentrate on the faces of the saints because you've got a low ambient light. But so if you refer back to the nature of the human person, that we're called for repentance, called for union with God, to discern the logoi of God within creation, if you start at that point, then a lot of these aesthetic judgments become a lot clearer. And it's not just a matter of different cultures. Everything's valid in a different culture.
Because if you look at what happened to Roman art, I think it's a great example where you could see it happen. So when you look at the development of icon style and iconography, you can see, if you know how to look, you'll notice how the Christian artists took Roman types and Roman ways of representing gesture, representing clothing, representing faces, and transformed it very deliberately. And so we don't have texts that tell us what the reasons are for all the different decisions. But as an artist, you can look and you can understand what they've done, and you can compare, you can see the transition. And I think that those decisions and those transitions, they're deliberate theological choices to transform the Roman style into what became the Christian style. And so it doesn't mean that that's the only way that it can be done. That's not what it means, but it means that we have to be sensitive and understand that these were deliberate choices moving towards a certain type of imagery. And so when those decisions become undone, and some of the choices, are returned back to the ancient Roman style, where we now increase the contrapposto, we increase the sensuality of the icon, we have to ask ourselves, okay, so why is this happening? Are there theological reasons why this is happening? Or is this just a kind of movement of culture and style? And like Andrew said, I think we can look at these icons. I also don't have a problem to pray in front of the 19th century icons, or to kiss them or to venerate them. But I do think that there is kind of decision-making that happened that developed the style that we recognize in the early church. And those are important to take into account, especially as artists, if we're going to dive into liturgical art.
I also want to say that some of these styles, like Baroque, that may have proved not very effective for liturgical art in the context of painted icons, may actually be a wonderful solution for liturgical art in other contexts of the church construction. I think it's easy for us to agree that Baroque painting departed immensely from the sort of medieval understanding liturgically of how religious paintings are supposed to work, and that they're not really effective for Orthodox liturgical use. But I find Baroque church furniture to be quite wonderful. 17th century Russian furniture, for instance, or Athonite furniture that's got twisty columns and ornate carving. The furniture construction of the 17th century can be absolutely splendid. It can be iconic of all the beauty and exuberance of heaven. Also building facades, and all across the Mediterranean world, Spain, Italy, Greece, you see of medieval churches with a medieval interior, but a wonderful 17th or 18th century Baroque facade added on it. And that, to me, that's like the best of both worlds, because you know, Byzantine architecture did not pay any attention to facades. Byzantine churches tended to really not have a facade. They usually had a forecourt in front of them, and then the forecourt went missing at some point. And often the front of an old Greek church looks quite undesigned and utilitarian. But, you know, in Crete, for instance, many of those medieval churches, at some point, the Venetians came in and put a splendid Italian Baroque facade on the front of that church. And that just perfects the building.
Oh, no.
I was in Rome
I really thought they were going to go a long time arguing about this.
a week ago, and I'm
Yes.
standing in front of St. Mary Major, and they put their Baroque facade, and they had the I don't know why, they
Mhm.
left a glimpse of the old,
Mhm.
mosaic underneath the facade, and they just planked the post like straight through the images, almost like right into the angels where these Baroque facades.
Well-
You're looking through the window and you're like, wow, it's so beautiful, and then this aggressive thing.
Well, you're talking about a church that had a splendid 14th century facade before it had a Baroque facade. I'm talking about churches that never had any facade.
I can tell you about another facade.
Yeah.
No,
Sorry.
I think,
You get the liturgical art is going, and like,
Mhm.
I'm a bit too excited about. these
no,
things.
as we bring this all to a close, what's unquestionable is that we've heard from people who are actually doing this stuff and doing it, I'll say again, with results that are just so stunningly beautiful. And so that says something. And then to hear how these same people reflect on their craft and reflect on their art and its theological, aesthetical, and other wider sense of meanings is really wonderful. We've gained a lot, and yet it's also feels like we've only just begun a conversation that is going to need to be continued in all kinds of ways between us and in much wider settings. So I want to just begin by thanking the three of you for coming and Dr. Schroeder for joining this. I would love to just hear some applause for what we've heard. That speaks volumes. If you have enjoyed this conversation and can imagine other good things coming from our Institute of Sacred Arts, please consider visiting the seminary website or our Sacred Arts Institute, instituteofsacredarts.com website, and consider contributing to our work so that we could do more of this kind of work. But I want to thank you all for coming from many faraway places and some not so far away. Thank the online listeners, viewers, and anybody who's seeing this after the fact. All of that was made possible by a wonderful technical staff. Those of you who are here, as I said, are welcome to join us for a light reception, and we will enjoy engaging with you there. Thank you. Christ is risen.